special service to viewers in this area, a number of local organizations which dealt with the treatment of AIDS and AIDS-related problems will be handling two special phone services throughout tonight's broadcast of AIDS, a national inquiry.
For Frontline is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. And
Frontline. It's been called the plague of the 20th century. First, gay men, then hemophiliacs, then their wives and lovers, then children. 18,000 people, more than half are dead. 2 million more could get it. Tonight, live from Washington, Houston, Denver, and San Francisco, AIDS, a national inquiry.
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTBS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is Frontline with Judy Woodruff.
Good evening. This is a special 2-hour edition of Frontline. Here at the National Library of Medicine, we have gathered a panel of distinguished guests. Professor Charles Nesson of the Harvard Law School will lead a discussion here this evening. We are linked by satellite to 3 cities. Houston, where a city is divided by the story we will see tonight. San Francisco, the city that knows most painfully the tragedy of AIDS. And Denver, a city which has fashioned its own response to an epidemic. In about 10 minutes, we will show you a documentary film about a person with AIDS. It is an unusual and unique story about one man's tragic journey across the United States. It is a film that raises questions about public and personal responsibility, about prejudice and fear. In fact, our biggest fear of AIDS seems to stem from what most of us don't know about it. How do you get it? Who has it? What do we do about it? First, there are essentially 2 ways for the AIDS virus to be transmitted: from contaminated blood products and by certain types of sexual activity in which blood or semen are exchanged. Sexual intercourse and needles shared by drug users are the primary ways the disease is spread. Second, you should know that now 10,000 people have died from AIDS. Another 8,000 people are dying from the disease. Over 150,000 people have ARC, AIDS-related complex. They have some of the symptoms. They are not well. And finally, between 1 and 2 million people are believed to have AIDS antibodies in their bloodstreams. That would mean in order to have an antibody, they must have had or still have the AIDS virus. But they have no symptoms. They otherwise feel well. Most don't know that they may be carriers. The important concept to understand is that every year a large percentage of the people in each of those groups move into the group above. That means in the next year the death toll will have risen from 10,000 to almost 15,000 people. A total of as many as 30,000 will have had AIDS. 250,000 may have ARC, and over 2 to 3 million will be carrying the antibody and probably the virus. That is the scale of this epidemic. And who does it affect? 3% are hemophiliacs and blood transfusion patients. 8% are heterosexual men and women and children. 17% are intravenous drug users. And 72% are gay and bisexual men. In fact, it is the gay community devastated by this disease that knows the most about AIDS. And clearly, it is from the gay community that we have to learn how to respond to it, what human and political resources we need to deal with it. Diego Lopez is the Director of Clinical Services for the Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City. He's a clinical social worker and a psychotherapist in private practice. Since 1981, he has counseled hundreds of people with the disease, their families, their friends, and lovers. Professor Charles Nesson will begin our discussion tonight here at the National Institute of Health.
Mr. Lopez, tell us your story. Well, I was just recently diagnosed with AIDS less than a month ago, and it's turned my life upside down. And this, I must say that I'm someone who knows a lot about negotiating with systems, about this disease, about what it does to people, and I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared sufficiently to deal with the anxiety, the emotional stress, the stress to my family and my life partner, the difficulties with telling them myself, and they're hearing from me and from my own lips that I had Kaposi sarcoma. The difficulty in observing the pain in their faces and in their reactions was also paramount in the manner in which I kind of dealt with people. It was very important to me, and it became very important to me that people hear it from me. The people that meant a lot in my life ought to hear what's happening regarding my health from my own lips and not from hearsay or word of mouth. As a result, I've been able to gather a lot of support from my family and my friends. However, it's still made my life difficult. I don't know how I'm going to feel from day to day. I can't work the way I used to. I have a great fear of being dependent and losing control. And I've been a very independent person throughout my life. This is the first time since I'm 16 that I can't go to work every day.
How old are you now?
I'm 40 years old. I was just 40. And it just astounds me that my life has changed so drastically in 4 weeks. And I have to stress that because I've been able to drum up a lot of support and love and care, and I know how to negotiate with hospital systems. I've been in a hospital. I really directed the kind of treatment I expected to receive there, and as a result, I received it. But it doesn't...
Can I turn to Dr. Wassi? Dr. Wassi, what can medicine do for Mr. Lopez?
I think the first thing medicine can do is to treat him fairly and without judgment, to let him know accurately and honestly what is available and what isn't available, to be able to say that we can do this and to say honestly that we can't do that, but allow hope that things have changed so much on a month-by-month basis that there may be something in the near future that we can offer that we don't have now. And most importantly, to recognize that he's an individual, and just because so many have gone through it before, he has to uniquely go through it for himself.
I hear the "we don't have it now" though line very prominently in what you say.
We don't have any answers now. No.
Dr. Krim, what sort of social support does the system have to offer Mr. Lopez?
Well, the system has to offer a lot of things, Mr. Lopez. To start with, a system of medical care that is relevant to his problems and his needs. I don't believe we have this today in this society. We have acute care hospitals. We don't have hospitals or institutions who can take care of patients over the long run, of patients who are not necessarily acutely ill for long periods of time, but nevertheless need medical follow-up, sometimes on very short notice, need supportive services, legal advice, economic help very often, and so forth.
Mr. Lopez, who has been your support in this? What support have you had?
My family. And I think because of my openness and honesty, which they kind of taught me to be as a person, it made it possible for them to understand and accept my sexuality years ago, and it's also made it possible for them to interact with me regarding my health. So they've been extremely supportive. I think my mom especially, I mean, we have a very open relationship and we talk very openly, and she's furious, she's angry. I asked her, Mom, how do you feel? You know, is there any sense of guilt or blame that you're feeling? Or do you think I ought to feel that way? And her response was no. She goes, you've been a good human being. You've made your contribution to society. I am proud of you. I am angry as a result. I think it's unfair. You don't deserve to be stricken with this illness, this horrible disease. My lover, Ed, has been tremendously supportive. We've been together for 2 years, and my concern for him is that could he possibly have this disease too? And we're living on a tightrope right now. Our relationship is very supportive of each other, but it's also under a great deal of stress right now. He's living under a tightrope and having to explain to his family that he's okay. We've always been embraced by both our families, but this time he'll be going home for Easter without me because he needs to do a lot of follow-up work there that's necessary for him to do with his family without my presence.
Well,
I think my friends
thank you,
also.
Mr. Lopez. We'll be coming back to you shortly. You're about to see a film now about a person who had none of the support that Mr. Lopez here described. And for that, let me turn you back to Judy Woodruff.
The film you will now see is controversial. That's because it's a portrait of a man with AIDS who continued to be promiscuous. In San Francisco and other cities, the organized gay community is protesting the film because they say that it is unfair to persons with AIDS. They believe that the general population will be unduly alarmed by this story and conclude that this man's behavior is the rule rather than the exception. Last July, we started looking at the ways AIDS was beginning to test our society. The implications were startling. Schools, health care, fundamental concepts of individual rights and civil liberties, trust in our leaders and in the experts, all these seemed at risk. We traveled across the country to find examples of those new problems and began filming several stories. But one of them emerged as something unique. It is the story of one man and how he tested people and institutions wherever he went. His is not the typical story of a person with AIDS, and in our view, the choices he made about how to live his life are rare. But Fabian Calvin Bridges was a real person who tried the limits of our system and raised questions for which we must find answers. This is Fabian's story, and I must warn you, it contains graphic descriptions of sexual behavior.
When we came to Houston, we came looking for a story about AIDS. We found a city like many others, a healthcare system overwhelmed, bewildered doctors and frightened patients. When we came to Houston, we didn't know Fabian Bridges. He was just one of the faceless victims.
I met Fabian about 1975. After I got out of school and moved to Houston in about 1979, we would keep in contact by phone and letters.
Fabian's friend Shirley.
Fabian decided that he would like to start a new career and move here and see if Houston would be profitable for him.
Fabian had several jobs after he arrived in Houston, and in 1982, he signed on with a Harris County flood control crew like this one. At night, he liked to go dancing and listen to music. He spent time in the nightclubs and gay bars in Houston's Montrose district. Fabian was 29 years old. He was making close to $19,000 a year, and life seemed promising.
You still waiting for your ampicillin?
Yeah.
Okay, well, they'll get it pretty soon.
Dr. Robert Awe is Chief of Pulmonary Medicine at Jefferson Davis Public Hospital in Houston. He consults on most AIDS cases there.
I first met Fabian Bridges in early April of '85 after I'd gotten a call from a doctor in a satellite clinic that she thought she had an AIDS patient and wanted to admit him to our hospital for evaluation. He came over here and had many AIDS-related infections, did indeed have AIDS, and was diagnosed here 3 or 4 days after his arrival as having AIDS. He was very, very sick. He had very high fevers. He had persistent diarrhea.
When I went to Texas, they told me exactly what condition my son was in and how long, they expect for him to live and everything. and for me to try to make arrangements for his funeral, because he wasn't going to live long.
But Fabian wasn't ready to die. Like many AIDS patients, his condition improved. In July, after 3 months at Jefferson Davis, Fabian was no longer sick enough to stay. He'd lost his job, had no money, and there was nowhere for him to live outside the hospital.
Well, Fabian was ready to go home, and we met several times in discharge planning conferences to decide what would be the best, and Fabian's desire was to go back to his family in the north. And so we paid for a one-way plane ticket for him to go back there.
The doctors had done what they could. The hospital gave Fabian $100 and sent him to his sisters in Indianapolis.
We just didn't know enough about the disease, and we knew that when you had it, you would die, and that certain aspects of it, it was contagious.
Fabian's two sisters learned what they could about the disease, but with all the uncertainty surrounding AIDS, the family was afraid.
We weren't sure of how you can contact it. We heard only sexual contact, but now we're hearing other things like saliva or whatever. And we just didn't know and didn't want to take a chance.
I just couldn't have Calvin in the household with this little brat here running around. He's a terror around the house. He's in everything. Personal belongings. He even plays in the toilet, And with Calvin using the personal things around the house, he would pick them up. He wouldn't know any difference. He doesn't know what AIDS is. He doesn't know what homosexuality is. He's innocent. And I did not want to expose him to that, and I wouldn't. And I remember him calling one night asking, could he come over and stay, and he was crying, and I remember him saying to her, can I come over, do you have a sleeping bag? Can I sleep in your backyard? I think he had a basic need of wanting and needing to be around his family, and I think everybody realized that, and felt that. And I think that hurt. It hurt me. It hurt me to say no.
With no money, Fabian drifted around Indianapolis, sometimes staying in shelters for the indigent. One day, he began showing signs of a gonorrhea infection and went in for treatment. That day, about a month after he left Houston, Fabian got in trouble with the law.
Fabian Bridges was arrested for allegedly stealing a bicycle, and he's brought into the lockup here, and he's fingerprinted here and photographed right here in this chair. Then he was brought over and placed in the isolation cell right here to keep him away from the other prisoners so he wouldn't contaminate them or anybody else.
When he was arrested, Fabian told police he had AIDS. Deputy Terry Dale is a medical officer at the Marion County Jail.
I guess my biggest concern was for myself and the other prisoners and the other deputies that he possibly would come in contact with and spread the disease.
When Municipal Judge John Downer heard that an AIDS victim was being held, he left his courtroom to meet with the city prosecutor and the deputy.
I think the judge expressed a little concern that possibly other people in the courtroom might become frightened if they found out he had AIDS and cause a panic maybe, or, possibly even contaminate other people in the courtroom.
The prosecutor readily admitted, yes, we did drop the charges, and he gave his reasons why. Advantages, disadvantages. He said it was a minor, charge, a misdemeanor theft of a bicycle. We might have reconsidered if it were a felony or a serious violent crime, which it wasn't.
Kyle Niederpran is a police reporter for the Indianapolis Star. She covered Fabian's story.
They were even throwing away some of the pens and pencils that Fabian had used to sign some of his documents. So apparently in very short order, and I'm not sure of the time frame, he went to the jail, a decision was made quickly, a little meeting was had, and it was decided for best for all to release him and get him out of town.
The charges against Fabian Bridges were dropped, and then Judge Downer chipped in $20, and the county fund chipped in the rest of the money, and we provided a ticket to Cleveland, Ohio for Fabian Bridges to get home to his folks, because this is where he had informed me where his mother and father lived. So we made sure that he got the bus ticket, and then I transported him to the bus station and made sure he got on the bus okay.
Here's a man who's dying. He's just dying, you know, of AIDS or whatever. We have a dying man. He's homeless. He's got nothing. And nobody wants him. And, you know, he probably would have died in obscurity if no one had stumbled upon his story, if no one had called, you know, us to pursue it.
It was Kyle Niederprem's story that first led us to Fabian. It was a story about the alienation and rejection that many AIDS victims suffer. So in late August, we came to Cleveland to find Fabian. We started by checking the shelters. Then we heard he might be staying in this hotel.
What was it like when you first found out you had AIDS?
Well, I was sitting in the office at this private hospital, York Plaza, and I don't know, my world just started crumbling. I just sat there a minute and it seemed like I could see everything flash right before me, and I just sat on the thing that's the bed like and started crying, you know. I said to myself, my life is over. This is where it stopped. You see, you know,
Fabian told us he was still angry about what happened in the Indianapolis jail.
I felt I was being treated like an animal. You know, they didn't care. The only thing they cared about was not getting disease. And after I got there, they put me in this waiting cell. And I was there for about 2 hours. And all of a sudden, the sheriff, the policemen, peons, maintenance people, they all just came by and got a glance and started whispering and went out the other way. I was so humiliated, I just could have grabbed them by their neck and just choked the hell out of them. Choked the life right out of them. Or if I had the power to transmit the disease by throwing my hand at something, I would have. And then just sat back and laughed at them, see how they react. But I was just fantasizing. They treated me real dehumanized. It was beyond slavery. When the damn thing I could do, I just, after all that, I turned around in the cell and just hit my head against the corner and just started crying.
We spent several days with Fabian, and he agreed to let us tell his story. Fabian told us that when he first arrived in Cleveland, he called his mother from the bus station. He called her again while we were with him.
Oh, can you possibly come pick me up? Why not? George.
Fabian's stepfather would not let him stay at his mother's house.
Can I come over? Well, where am I going to stay? You want me to stay in the street? I'll call you later.
Fabian went to the Red Cross for help. They couldn't find a shelter that would take a person with AIDS, so they paid for the hotel room where we found him. Fabian had applied for Social Security disability while he was still in the hospital in Houston, and now, 2 months later,
he was still waiting for his first check.
I miss you.
He said he had no money, so sometimes we bought him meals, and we had his laundry done. One day, Fabian saw a small portable radio he liked. We bought it for him. Fabian hung out on the streets and said he made friends there. He spent time in adult bookstores and movie houses, and, he admitted, it was a way he helped support himself.
I was in this hot peep show down here on 4th Street. They just come and go. You pick, you know. Sometimes I do it for money, especially when I ain't got any. I did it for money yesterday. $5.
After Fabian said this, we questioned him more closely about his sex life. Fabian told us that sometimes he had sex for money, other times for affection. He told us a disturbing story of what had happened a few nights before.
So we got to here. I told him to be very quiet, we were walking in. You know, I told the people at the desk that I don't bring rowdy people in, which I don't. So we got in, came upstairs, and I had a couple of pops, great pops up here. I asked him, did he want something to drink? I also had some gin that I downed real quick. And I had a half a square, smoked that. And we started intimately having sex. I worked on him first because he had on these sexy parachute pants, black. And then we cut the lights down low and cut the music down low. And I told him he can get comfortable, you know. What I liked about him was he was very affectionate. That's what I liked. Hugging, snuggling up.
Did you kiss?
No kissing. Wanted to.
What happened?
After that, we just laid here. It wasn't no quick bam, thank you, ma'am. It was, I like to take my time and let the moment stretch out. And I tried to convince him to spend the night, but he had to go to work. He had to be up at 6. By that time, I was about 3 or 4. So he got up and cleaned up. After I came, or did I come? Came inside him. Accident. So the minute I was pulling it out, it was coming out. And I cleaned him up. Cleaned each other up. We got dressed and we exchanged phone numbers. He called me the other night.
Does he know you have AIDS? Do you worry about him?
He seems pretty healthy.
Fabian's story had suddenly changed. He was no longer just a victim. After Fabian told us he was having unsafe sex, we faced a dilemma. Should we report him to authorities or keep his story confidential, knowing that he could be infecting others? We decided to tell health officials what we knew. To our surprise, they told us the Cleveland police had already informed them Fabian was suspected of soliciting, but the health department said it considered that information only a rumor and had not investigated.
The information I get is this fellow's out on the streets and engaging in sex acts or something.
Someone who did act on our information was George Forbes, president of the Cleveland City Council.
You're soliciting on prospects? Okay. Yeah, but that was, they arrested him when? Friday of last week. Okay.
Forbes called the Cleveland City Health Director to find out what was going on.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye. He was arrested Friday for soliciting. He was back out on the street Monday. He said, "You're right. We got a right to protect people."
What are you going to do?
I don't know.
That's what I'm saying. It came yesterday, and she now withholding it. She done stuck it in a bank without my consent, and I'm going to call the cops on her.
By this time, Fabian's disability check had finally come to his mother's house. It covered several months and amounted to about $1,800.
I take me and try to make arrangements for my son's funeral. I did what they told me to do in Texas, I thought I was doing what was right. But I asked my daughter what she thought about it. She said, "Oh, Mama," said, "I think that's wonderful, because the doctor said he wasn't going to live long. You know what I mean?" And she said, because if anything should happen, said, we wouldn't have any money to bury him. So, "Mama, I think that's so beautiful." And then I called my mother and asked her, and she said the same thing. She said, "Yeah, I was worried about it." She said, "Baby, go ahead and do it." And that's what I did.
Fabian's mother had invested the Social Security money in a funeral for him. When Fabian found out, he demanded she get it back.
All these $100 bills.
He said, "You know you're going to die."
There is no shit.
And he said he didn't care how they put him away, but, he figured that the city could bury him. All he wanted was his money.
That a whole year.
Well, thank you. Was I sure?
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
I don't need to count it. I just need to cling on to it.
I'm your mother. You understand what I'm talking about? You don't trust your mother. Who can you trust?
That's true.
But you don't even trust me.
I'm not so sure about this world,
Well, you better be sure, because you're going to need somebody by your side. Without a mother, you lost.
Yeah.
Without a mother,
Without
you lost.
family.
Here's a case where a fella knows that he has it. This is the hell with it. I'm going. How many am I going to take with me?
Council President Forbes called officials of health, legal, and social services together to decide what to do about Fabian.
What the hell do you do? I mean, the guy admits, at least George and I think, that from his statements, he has admitted that he has had anal intercourse and that he has AIDS and that he didn't care. And he is on the streets.
We've had the right to quarantine against smallpox and things of this nature that were deadly diseases, and we put quarantine signs on houses saying that this house is quarantined. Now, if we could do it for diseases that was not as deadly as this, I'm damn sure we can do it in this particular case. Now, I don't think we are as helpless as you think we are.
There are laws. I think the Ohio regs address certain diseases as being quarantinable, but AIDS is not one of them.
Correct. With this one, you can't detain them for an indefinite period of time, feasibly anyway. I think what you can do is evaluate them as to whether they're mentally competent and perhaps find some other routes. I mean, there really is no precedent. Diana talked with other cities and states to find out how they're dealing with the problem. And we're right now at the forefront of deciding how to make public health policy. There is nothing.
I think it would be good if we had a state policy that we could all buy into and establish, so that the chief of police in Cleveland or Cleveland Heights and the county commissioner in Cuyahoga County or in Lorain County or in Trumbull County know exactly where the hell we're going on this.
And of course, we at the state say it'd be wonderful if they had a national policy to give us some direction. And so.
But I mean, you know what? They don't give a damn nationally. The bottom line is we've got a guy in the street here. I mean, that's the bottom line. George is right. The guy's got a gun. He's out shooting people. You don't die in 15 seconds. You die in 2 years by the statistics. I mean,
it's slow and painful.
And it's a slow, anguishing, painful death. And what did we say collectively as a group of people representing the society?
The point they're trying to deal with is a touchy legal question. Does the city have the authority to arrest this person? The police say no, because he isn't breaking the law. But do they have a moral obligation to protect the unsuspecting victims? They've agreed to try and isolate this person. State health officials will meet with him and try to convince him to stop his sexual activity and agree to being isolated for treatment. The city's law department is also reviewing the situation to try and draft some legislation to deal with this ever-increasing problem in the city of Cleveland.
The reaction of the gay community when, Fabian's story hit the press was one of anger. How could someone like that, who was ill and going out, how could anyone infect other people? And I think one step further, their anger was turning into, we need to find this guy and get him off the street.
After George Forbes' meeting, Buck Harris was given the job of finding Fabian. Harris works for the State Department of Health and is a leader of Cleveland's gay community.
Concerns were, we can't allow this disease to be spread. I had bar owners and managers of bars who called me that night or whom I ran into over the weekend and said, what does he look like? Has he been in our bar? You have a right to tell us. And if he's in here, well, I think quite honestly it would have been sort of a lynch mob mentality. I don't think Fabian would have walked out of that bar with his sexual organs intact.
Buck Harris never found Fabian. What none of us knew was that Fabian had taken his money and left town. Fabian had disappeared, but what had happened to him was becoming widely known. Time magazine wrote about Fabian, calling him a pitiful nomad. The article also said he was headed back to Houston. Three weeks later, in late September, we received a call. It was Fabian. When we met him in Houston, Fabian told us he'd been hanging out in bars and living in bathhouses.
When I got here, knowing me, I just let everything go. Making all my rounds and seeing who I haven't seen, going where I haven't gone, and doing what I haven't did.
When he could no longer afford the bathhouses, Fabian began living on the streets and sleeping in empty buildings, where, he said, he brought people for sex. Fabian told us he was broke again. He'd spent his Social Security money trying to pay off an old debt and had squandered the rest. He took us to an abandoned house where he'd left some clothes.
It's just a mouse.
Because Fabian didn't know where he was going to sleep, we gave him $15 a night for 3 nights to buy a cheap hotel room. We gave him the money on the condition that he not practice unsafe sex and that he stay away from the bathhouses. Fabian also told us he was planning to see his doctor.
Well, Fabian, how are you? Welcome back to Houston.
Yeah.
You've been traveling all over the country. Have a seat.
Making Time magazine.
How have you been feeling?
Fine.
Have you really? Not having any trouble with shortness of breath?
No.
Okay. Have you noticed any blue bumps or brown bumps on your skin anywhere?
No. Just insect bites and stuff like that.
Let me be sure those are insect bites.
I have one on my leg, right? Sort of purple.
None of these are capuchins. You know, one of the things AIDS patients get is a skin tumor called capuchins, but you don't have that. That's not important. Where are you staying now?
Here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah, that's one of the problems. That's why you made Time magazine. You have got to find a place to stay and settle there. You know, you can't be freaking out public health departments all over the whole United States. Let me just look in your mouth a second. Okay, that looks good. Okay, well, I don't feel any lymph glands anywhere.
I remember I used to couldn't run because it drains me, but now I can run.
So you're in remission now. So that's good.
What is that?
Well, remission means that your disease is under control.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's cured,
Yeah.
but it means it's under control for right now. It's not bothering you. But you do understand you have AIDS, right? And you know how you can transmit AIDS.
Yeah.
Through sexual contact and through blood.
Yeah.
Those are the only two ways you can transmit it. Now, one thing that bothers me is that Time article said that you were
peddling,
quote-unquote, peddling sex. Is that true, Fabian?
Sort of, yeah.
So you can't do that. No, that's not funny. You've got a disease that is almost always fatal, and you're giving it to people all over the country. Now that just isn't using common sense.
I'm not, when I masturbate or ejaculate, it's not getting in them or on them.
You're sure of that?
Mm-hmm. I'm making sure of that.
Well,
I'm not kissing no one. That's another way to get it.
So you're not exchanging body fluids. You know what safe sex means. Okay. Well, just the same, I talked to Dr. Houghton, Fabian. He's the county public health director here.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you stay in Houston, he's going to send you a letter, which we'll deliver on Monday, saying that you have to restrain from sexual activities, and particularly from prostitution. If you do that in Houston, then you can be put under protective custody. And we just can't take the chance, Fabian. Now, if you behave yourself, and we want to take care of you. If you get sick, we'll be glad to see you anytime. But if you go out and start being a male prostitute, then we're going to have to call the constables and have you locked up. We just can't do that because we're not talking about
be locked up.
We're not talking about clap. Something you can cure with penicillin. We're talking about a disease you can't cure. And therefore, it's your obligation not to spread it to other people. You just can't do that.
I've slowed down quite a bit, though.
Yeah, well, more than slow down. You got to stop it.
But Fabian ignored Dr. Oz and our warnings. We discovered he didn't use our money for hotel rooms, and he admitted he was still having unsafe sex.
You just can't be spreading a disease that's going to kill people.
He remains infectious until we find a cure, or the people who are doing the research find a cure, or until he dies.
After talking to Fabian's doctor, Houston Public Health Director James Houghton and his staff weighed their options.
Where we detain him becomes a more critical question, because from what Dr. Aw told us, his diagnosis was only made in July, and so there's a good possibility that this could go on for 2 years. And furthermore, this person is in remission now.
That means
he's not demonstrating, he looks fine. He's not demonstrating any signs of illness.
That was my bed right there. I had a nice view. I raised all kind of hell in here. I wanted... He's in terrible shape.
Yeah.
Some of these people scare me. It's hard for me to sit here and realize that I have it. I'm not fooling myself. For a disease to be so dreaded, it's like something's missing. Those patients we saw the other day in Jeff Davis, and that's what I expect, to be laying there, short of breath and about ready to go. That's what I expect out of that disease, and something so dreaded.
But if you know how dreadful the disease is, and you saw those people in Jeff Davis, you know how dreadful the disease is, how could you go ahead and take a chance that you might give it to somebody?
I don't know. I guess I'm to the point where I just don't give a damn, I really don't.
You have to make the determination on medical grounds whether or not having sex with someone who has a documented case of AIDS presents any greater public health risk. Then you may as well go ahead. If it doesn't present any greater public health risk, you may as well leave something in like that.
Dr. Houghton's solution was to deliver a carefully worded letter to Fabian, which essentially ordered him not to have sex.
Change it that way, but I think that one's going to cause more trouble than we'll be able to handle.
What does that letter say, essentially?
Read it. What's your understanding of it?
Stop having sex in the world.
Is that going to be easy for you?
Very hard. I'm going to try.
It was explained to me that Dr. Houghton's letter is written in such a manner where he cannot exchange any fluids with anybody. He cannot give blood. That's a violation.
Dr. Houghton turned over the job of enforcing the letter to the Houston Vice Squad. It was the first time in his career he had called the police in on a health problem.
I talked to him about whether we could go out and make a prostitution case or engage in sex with him, an offer to engage in sex with him, and they told me that their appellate division is going to look into it, but it appears like that we have to either catch him in the actual act of engaging in a sex act or, do it ourselves, and which obviously we're not going to do. Not me. So we're kind of caught between a catch-22 deal here. If we can't make the case, then we're kind of out of this deal.
Dr. Reed, my name is Captain Fulbright, Jack Fulbright, in charge of the Vice Division here in Houston. I need to talk to you about a problem that we've got. I'm finding it hard to believe that the health department does not have any power of arrest. Maybe the city health department doesn't have any power of arrest, but maybe the people that work for the state do. Yeah. I know Paul Bibber real well. And, okay, thank you very much. I've gotten total all the way back around the Paul Bibber.
I went that same circle.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. I've talked to Reeve and Bibler and...
What'd they say?
Well, I don't know. Reeve said to talk to Bibler.
And Bibler will tell you to talk to Bush. And
talk to who?
Ted Bush, over in the DA's office.
Well, hell, they don't know anything.
But apparently this is what you're talking about. They've already notified him.
They've already notified him.
So they consider they've done their job?
That's what I'm assuming, that
they want us to on view him having sex with somebody.
On view him having sex with somebody.
No way.
Well, if you locate him and you watch him start doing things with people, you're going to have to, in good conscience, you're going to have to stop him from going off with somebody, and you have no grounds to do that.
You go looking for him, and you see him, and he gets picked up by that guy, and they take off. You know damn good and well what they're fixing to do.
And I'm not,
So what are you going to do?
You've opened yourself up to just one hell of some litigation by somebody.
The guy just getting in a car with somebody, he ain't violating the law.
Yeah, well, maybe legally you haven't done anything wrong, but morally you got that obligation, and this department's going to get burnt real big for it.
Just think how many people cruise around the bus station. They're going to go, I remember that guy, and they let me do that. Buddy, if you don't think your butt's not in a frying pan, you're wrong.
We can get out there, the four of us can get out there, and hopefully he'll hit on one of us. Yeah, he may hit on one of us. He may not. He may not. We can get him to hit on one of us, go ahead and make our regular old prostitution case, put him on ice for a little bit. Got out of the car yet?
He's stopping right now and letting me out.
We're down here by the fire.
Okay, I'm at Main and Franklin. I'm going to get out and check that one black gay bar before I hit the show.
After 2 days of surveillance, the Vice Squad's attempts to arrest Fabian on a soliciting charge failed. Frustrated, the police began looking for other solutions. They called an old political adversary, gay activist Ray Hill.
Because my name was the only one that they thought of, and they called me, and then, of course, I immediately, like virtually everybody else in this story, said, this is not my problem, let's give it to somebody else. I called KSH Foundation and gave them the rundown while I was still waiting for directions to get one of them to go get him instead of me, because I really ought not to be messing in those people's business as professionals.
But the person I talked to wasn't really interested in doing anything, and I figured that by the time he decided to do something, I didn't have that much time to wait. So I decided to go ahead and take the responsibility on myself.
What did the person at the AIDS Foundation say to you?
We don't want to get involved. There's too much media on this already.
And what was your reaction to that?
Screw you. I'll find some help somewhere.
The disease that killed that famous actor is the same one afflicting a transient who now has got Houston health officials very concerned this afternoon. The man reportedly is a prostitute who may still be engaging in sex with strangers.
When police tipped off the local media to what was happening, Fabian became headline news.
There are some late developments in this case just this afternoon. Jamie O'Rourke live right now from the Montrose area. Jamie, what's happening?
Right, Shara and Bob, it looks like police have changed their tactics just a little bit right now. That fellow that we're talking about is Fabian Bridges. He's 30 years old, and presently he's right across the street at Charlie's Coffee Shop. We're in the Montrose area. He's at Charlie's Coffee Shop talking to gay political activist Ray Hill, counseling with him right now. Channel 13, Eyewitness News, has the only pictures of Fabian Bridges, and we should look at those now. Those were taken just a short while ago as Ray Hill succeeded in contacting Fabian Bridges and got him to get into Hill's car, and they drove over here to Charlie's Coffee Shop where Hill is now counseling with Bridges.
Health department essentially had dumped onto the vice squad their problem because they didn't know what to do. And the whole thing was a circus of people trying to find solution to a problem they didn't understand in an environment in which they could not possibly have solved the problem. So all the official efforts were farces and failures.
It would never have occurred to me to turn to the gay community for help in resolving this problem. They came forward and offered to take him under control and to keep him off the street and to befriend him and to provide for him. That was a resource that would not have occurred to me to look to.
This was 30-year-old Fabian Bridges as he voluntarily checked himself into the psychiatric ward of Ben Taub Hospital yesterday.
As media attention intensified, authorities gave Fabian a choice: check into a hospital for psychiatric evaluation or be jailed on a loitering charge.
Enforcement and health officials were constantly tailing the sick man.
Fabian chose the hospital, but 2 days later, he demanded to be released.
The man police say is a prostitute suspected of spreading AIDS is reportedly back on the streets again tonight.
Around 5 this afternoon, a Houston vice officer announced that Fabian Bridges, an alleged male prostitute with AIDS, had been released from Ben Taub's mental ward. Bridges has been released to the custody of gay activist Ray Hill, but Dr. James Houghton of the Health Department has requested continued police surveillance of Bridges.
We're going to be monitoring his progress.
Why are you going to be monitoring?
Just more or less for the safety and health and some of the citizens of Houston.
Hill says Bridges will be seeing a psychiatrist and staying with friends in the gay community.
The AIDS Foundation finally came through for Fabian. A lawyer on its board of directors took him into his home. We lost touch with Fabian after that. The gay community was protecting him from the local press and from us. But his story would continue to have an effect on events to come.
No street person in Houston has made an impact on our city like Fabian Bridges, and it's one that's going to be felt from City Hall to Austin for a long time.
This case does open up a brand new set of ethical questions for society to answer.
Prompted City Health Director Dr. James Houghton to propose a national first, a plan to quarantine all AIDS patients like Fabian who won't stop having sex.
Fabian was safe now, living in the home of a friend, away from the controversy surrounding him. We remembered something he'd said to us earlier in Cleveland.
Let me go down in history as being, I am somebody, somebody that'll be respected, somebody who's appreciated, and somebody who can be related to. There's a whole lot of people just go. They're not even on the map. They just go.
But the inevitable happened. Fabian's AIDS symptoms returned. Just 1 week after he moved into his new home, Fabian went back to the hospital. This time, he stayed just over a month.
After Fabian was transferred up to the intensive care unit, we got him fairly well stabilized. His blood pressure came up a little bit, and we thought he might respond to the medication that we had him on for his blood poisoning. So I went home, and then about 8 o'clock at night, I got a call from the resident that Fabian had started bleeding from his stomach and from his nose, and his blood pressure was falling again. So I came in, and we started another central line on him, which is just a big tube to try to get more medicine and more blood into him. And we pumped in all sorts of medication to try to stop him from bleeding. But he did not respond to that. He had a convulsion, went into a coma, and then went into shock and died very peacefully, actually. He was not in pain during the last day of his life.
Fabian died on November 17th. His family had no money to bury him, so after a week, he was given a pauper's funeral and buried in the county cemetery.
He was buried here about 2 weeks ago. And he is where he lies, right here. But the reason why the grave site looks like this is due to the fact that we've been having a lot of rain, and it's a fresh grave.
Mr. Lopez, as a person with AIDS yourself, you must have a reaction to Fabian's story.
I do. I really see this as a real victimization of this person by all institutions that failed him. I see the medical field failed him, the hospitals failed him, the section on talking what the hospital told the parents and the family members, where were the patient advocates, where were the social workers. The legal system failed him. The church, where they could have come in and done some negotiating and some educating and some compassion, honest caring with that family and their pain, and this person failed him. I think basically the medical field treated him extremely racist, and as a child, I think he was failed by psychiatry for the apparent beginning of dementia that set forth for this man to think that he would go down in history as a hero. I think the lack of education, information to all, and then the issue of homophobia throughout was obvious. Homophobia.
What is homophobia?
I mean, the fear of homosexuals, the inability of people who are not gay not to understand what it means to be gay. You know, gay is not just what people do sexually, all right?
You can certainly see fear of Fabian in the film.
Absolutely, and I think that's a manifestation of people's difficulty in dealing with the issue of sexuality and difference and change. And it's also, I think it's not an accident that he's black, he's gay, and he's ill.
Dr. Silverman, this film has created controversy. Why?
I think it's created controversy because it has painted a picture and stated as reality what is really an aberration. Not that this man didn't do what he did, and it's reprehensible, and I don't think anyone gay or straight would disagree with that. I think it demonstrates an exploitation by the media, following him around, not providing the needed services that he should have had.
You think the media should have provided the services?
I don't think it's the role of the media, but since he was the star of the program that we've just seen, and the people in the media who were filming this knew the acts he was engaging in and gave him $15 and a radio and these sorts of things, rather than either providing enough money so that kind of activity shouldn't take place, or make sure that he was put place with gay associations, that he was given into a setting that would protect him and society. Instead, it was a hot story, and it is. It's a very heavy tape that we've just seen.
So what's the risk?
What's the risk?
Harm?
The harm?
The harm.
The harm, I feel, is that a lot of people in the public are going to see this as a stereotype of the gay male in America. In San Francisco, as one example, there has been a behavioral change unparalleled in the history of medicine. Over a 90% reduction in sexually transmitted diseases amongst the gay population. I don't know anything in the history of medicine, any group, that has changed such a basic behavior as this. Yet, that won't get on here. That'll be something I've said, something that is very transient and gone. The image of this man doing what he did, demented as he was, is going to stay in people's minds, and that's the fear that I have.
And stay in people's minds because of the pictures as opposed to the words.
That's right. I think pictures carry a great deal more strength than the words that are be uttered here today.
Mr. Bayer, can you put this film in context for us?
Yeah, I think that what it really demonstrates for us is how even in a situation where in principle we agree that a man's behavior is putting others at risk, how difficult it is to implement social policies that can be effective, that can be humane, and that can protect the public. After all, the police department, the public health department, all was struggling with this issue. What kind of surveillance do you need? What kind of interventions do you need to know whether or not someone is exchanging bodily fluids in the context of sex? I think it raises for us in a very critical way the limitations of strong public health interventions of a restrictive kind in trying to deal with a disease like AIDS.
Dr. Silverman, your comment indicates that you feel this is an aberrational example.
Yes.
Because Fabian knew that he had AIDS and was willingly transmitting it nonetheless.
Yes,
and that's what's aberrational.
Yes, that's what's aberrational. He was demented, and what he did is not what most people are doing, or almost no people. What is reality is the lack of services that were available. I mean, everyone failed him, as Diego has said. I disagree with Ron. I think in an individual case there are actions you can take, and I don't think anyone today in public health would ignore what was going on, nor would they pass it off. I think we would take decisive action in the individual case. This man needed psychiatric care. The first thing that should have been done, instead of the last, was to be seen by a psychiatrist.
All right, now what would have happened had Fabian been in San Francisco?
Well,
what would have happened had you been in charge of what was going on?
I would have had him seen by a psychiatrist.
A psychiatrist because?
Because the man was obviously demented. I think anyone who knowingly infects someone else with a lethal germ has a problem. You could see by the affect that this man had, how bland, how he was talking in almost histrionics. He wanted to go down as a hero, and I mean this man.
He said he didn't care. He said he just I don't care.
But he also wanted to be a hero. I mean, if you really carefully look at this, you see a man who is demented. You don't see a normal, rational individual. And I think he needed to be seen by psychiatrists, and if he was psychiatrically disturbed, he might have had to been, in fact, very likely would have to have been kept in a hospital and cared for properly, getting the proper mental health care and also the proper bodily care.
All right, now, what Fabian's story raises is the question of quarantine. Yes, you give him services. Perhaps if he had all the support that you could offer him, it would have been a different story.
Not quarantine. That's a misnomer.
Well, let's
isolation maybe, but not even isolation. Keeping him from infecting others through sexual activity.
If none of the support works to make him make his own choice, yes?
Yes.
Yes. So you call it isolation.
That's correct.
Now tell me how isolation is different from quarantine.
Quarantine basically and historically was when a ship would come into port from a country that may have been, or a port that may have been had a disease. They would keep the ship out in the water for 40 days and nights, and if no one on the ship came down with a disease, you let them then enter the port. Now we hear people talking about quarantine for anyone who has AIDS, who might be a positive antibody case. That means keeping them locked up for life. We have no cure today. So what we are saying is, if we're going to control the spread of this disease, and I don't think this is appropriate to control the spread of the disease from a public health standpoint, it is absolutely impossible from a a logistical viewpoint, because we may have 1.5 million to 2 million people infected. Are we going to lock them up, 90% of which are between the ages of 20 and 49? Are we going to lock them up for the rest of their life? When really what we have here is a disease of consenting adults. If we can educate people, the two high-risk behaviors which were described before by Judy, intimate sexual relations with the sharing of body fluids and the sharing of needles and syringes. If we get people to not do that, we can stop the spread of the disease tomorrow.
Mr. Bayer, I take it you're in agreement with...
Well, I mean, I just
Dr.
would like to
Silver.
underscore one thing. The talk of quarantine or isolation is very loose in our society today. In order to really implement the policy of quarantine, what you would need to do is to establish a system of universal, mandatory, and repeated screening of all Americans, to pick up every single individual who is antibody positive and presumed to have the virus, to isolate them from society. We're now talking about 1.5 million Americans, to put them God knows where. And it's not simply a logistical problem. Societies in the 20th century have shown that they know how logistically to do the most horrendous things. What happens to a society that's torn apart by the threat of a disease like this? Do we really need to use not only a Sherman tank, but an atomic bomb to deal with a disease that is threatening our society, when in fact we haven't really tried other mechanisms that might be more appropriate?
Congressman Dannemeyer, I take it that, pardon me for putting it this way, that even you are not in favor of mass quarantine.
Well, I think the events that have transpired over the course of the last year make very clear that it is appropriate for public officials, public health officials, people in government to be talking about that option, because it is something that needs to be discussed. I watched with sadness this movie. I don't know what the problem was really. What we need, in my judgment, are public health authorities with the judgment to take the action that was called for. A mentally ill petition was appropriate to file against this person early on. That is within the purview of public health authorities. It's been there for years. I used to file them when I was a deputy DA years ago.
But you hear Mr. Bayer saying we'd have to put away 1.5 million people if we were going to put away all the people that put you at risk.
You deal with these things. When you find a person manifesting conduct that Fabian was manifesting, he was mentally ill, in need of care, supervision, and treatment. Our society has been dealing with people manifesting that type of conduct, at least in California, for many years. It's a civil petition. They have a right to a jury trial. You have medical experts testify. If they're found to be mentally ill, they're placed in an institution until they recover their sanity. There's no real big deal about it. The problem is that...
That's a very different scheme than a mass quarantine. And we're not talking about...
That's an isolated case that I think is appropriate. You see...
Am I right, though, that you do not think it's appropriate to proceed on a lock-em-all-up theory?
No, I have not advocated that, but I think it's appropriate given the increasing number of cases and the fear that this will be transmitted beyond the risk groups that heretofore has been found in, that we start talking about the issue of quarantine in our society.
All right, let me go now to Houston, if I may. Dr. Hotze, I understand that you have pressed for quarantine in Houston.
Well, this is incorrect. I think what has happened in this show is we have seen the attempt by PBS to evoke an emotional, sympathetic response towards this individual whose life really characterizes all those who participate in homosexual activity. It's one that seeks inordinate lust for self-gratification, anonymous sexual partners that run up to 1,000 during a lifetime. It's moral anarchy. And what needs to be done in our society today is that our political leaders, our public health officials, and the media needs to come down foursquare against this activity and not give it public approval or sanction, either in the political forum or else on the media.
Yeah, but what do you mean by that?
Just what I said.
Come down hard on it. How do you come down hard on it?
Well, several things. First, in Texas, we have laws that prohibit sodomy. Law teaches individuals right and wrong. It teaches a code of conduct. That needs to be instituted nationwide to instruct individuals that this is a wrong, unacceptable behavior, as the public health officials have done on smoking, as they've done on illicit drug use. This lifestyle is unhealthy. It undermines the moral fabric of a community, and it's deleterious to the health of the individuals that participate in it. And I have yet to hear anyone come down and say,
Let me switch to Ray Hill, if I can. Mr. Hill, do you hear me?
Absolutely, I hear you.
And did you hear Dr. Hotze?
I did hear Dr. Hotze, and it's no surprise to me that Dr. Hotze would like to lock up 10 to 12 million Americans. That's everyday business around here.
What do you think it's all about? What do you think is going on with that kind of comment?
I don't know what, you see, the wrong thing to do here is exercise the power of government. Fabian, man out of control. The only thing out of control about Fabian when my community had him was his herpes and his bowels, which neither one were conducive to anybody agreeing to have sex with him. Fabian was not a problem for us. Fabian didn't slip out the window and go turn a trick. Locking people up, trying to control this disease with quarantine is like killing mosquitoes with a 30-06. It'll work if your aim is good enough, but you're blowing holes in the building so more mosquitoes can get in.
All right. Let me turn to this phrase, groups at risk. Dr. Wolfsey, review for us again. How is this disease transmitted?
It's really quite simple. It's transmitted either by sex, and it doesn't matter whether the person is homosexual or heterosexual. If one partner has the virus, the other partner might get it. The existing evidence suggests that it's much more likely for a male to transmit it to a female, but we presume that it's possible.
Why is that? Any idea?
We know it's in the sperm. We have, in the United States, the great majority of cases are in males. There are very few cases in the United States in which female-to-male transmission has been reasonably confirmed.
Is that, now I want to understand it, is that because the disease is more easily transmitted from the active partner, the penetrating partner, than to the passive partner?
Okay. Certainly in homosexual relationships, we know that the person who's inseminated is at greater risk than the person who inseminates. And in heterosexual transmission, the sperm, there's a large volume. There is the possibility of more breaks in the skin lining the female genital tract, perhaps where the virus can enter. It may enter through rectal sex, heterosexually or homosexually. From female to male, no one knows how the transmission occurs, if it occurs, but the skin is a very good barrier on the male genitals, so there'd have to be some breaks in the mucosa. We do know that the virus is found in blood, that women have blood in their vagina at certain times during the month. The virus has been found in cervical secretions, but in very, very small amounts. So the likelihood of transmission from cervical secretions per se is rather remote. At any rate...
So it sounds, from the way you describe it, that this disease can be quite readily transmitted to women.
Yes, very readily transmitted to women.
But then perhaps more difficult for women to transmit it back to men.
That's what we suspect epidemiologically, at least in the United States and in the Western Europe.
Now, is the disease transmitted by oral sex?
We don't know. There's really no evidence one way or another. It's hard to find a group of individuals who participate only in oral sex and have no other kind of sexual exposure. One can do it by some sorts of statistical analysis, but it would be hard to prove that a specific case of oral sex definitively transmitted the AIDS virus.
Dr. Krim, is kissing a risk?
Well, from what you just heard, the situation applies also to kissing. There is, virus has been isolated from saliva. We have no documented cases that were transmitted through kissing. So we have to say the evidence is that there is no such transmission, but we can't exclude the possibility that it can occur through kissing because there is virus in saliva, in certain patients at least. So kissing can occur, but it has to be friendly, superficial kissing.
And as to oral sex, it sounds to me as if the danger is certainly there. If there's any break in the skin inside the mouth or the gums, whatever.
Yeah, and same thing with kissing. It's quite possible that 99% of times kissing is not dangerous at all, but there is a possibility that somebody may have a break in the mucosa and his partner and his or her partner being infected could bleed, and if all these circumstances are realized simultaneously, there is a theoretical possibility of infection.
Now, Judy Woodruff talked about needles.
Yes. This is very important. A very important mode of transmission is through contaminated needles, and this is the way the virus is transmitted in the drug-addicted community. Needles are very often not available to drug addicts. They have to buy them only. They must show a prescription to buy needles. They don't have prescriptions. They have developed the habit of sharing a single needle among several people in so-called drug alleys. And the needle goes from one vein to another, carrying a little bit of the blood. If one of the partners sharing the needle is contaminated, he will contaminate everybody else in the group. And transmission of the virus leading to AIDS has been very rapid in the addicted community, in New York in particular.
All right,
and it's important to remember that this is the group that transmits the virus to the broader heterosexual community, because drug addicts are by and large heterosexual people. And the virus, the infection, is transmitted to the population at large through them.
So if we're talking about transmission to the heterosexual community, the avenues of transmission are through bisexual men who have sex with women and transmit to women.
That's one possibility.
And needle users.
And needle users
who are
are
female.
heterosexual. No, also male.
Male and female.
And female. And most of them are male. and they can contract the infection through contaminated needles and pass it on to either needles or through sex to others. And then if the partners are females and these get infected, their children become infected, you know. There is also transmission in utero or at birth to an infant.
So, Dr. Wofsy, when we talk about groups at risk, what are we talking about? What groups are we talking about? Sounds like everybody.
Potentially everybody. It's always defined as homosexual males comprise the largest group, 70-some%. Another 17% are IV drug users. A smaller group are hemophiliacs. Now that has been resolved by changing the nature of the materials, the anticoagulants that they're given. A smaller group than that has gotten AIDS via blood transfusion. That also has been addressed by testing of the blood supply. And then there's another group that's very small in percent, but it's growing slowly in number, and that's people who've gotten AIDS as a result of sexual activity alone. And that doesn't fall into a group. But I think we're naive if we think that everybody in a risk group has a label. I'm a gay male. I'm an IV drug user. I'm a hemophiliac. People don't look any particular part, and you can't tell. And the stereotypes of who looks like what or what socioeconomic group a person falls into isn't accurate. So you can't really tell who's in a group.
Dr. Dowdle, do you have a sense of where this disease is going? We talk about these risk groups, and from what Judy Woodruff said, it's, at this point, at least primarily, a disease of the gay community. Where is it going?
Well, certainly in Africa, the majority of the cases in Central Africa are heterosexual, heterosexually transmitted. There's no question about that. There's no doubt that heterosexual transmission will occur in this country, but the U.S. is not Africa. They're not the same practices, and it will not spread at the same rate. But there's no question that it will be very slowly spread unless precautions are taken.
All right, let's talk about precautions. Dr. Silverman, let me come back to you. There's the implication in what you've said about Fabian, about his being unusual, that if a person knows that they are a carrier of the AIDS virus, they're much more likely to alter behavior and basically to behave carefully. And that leads us to testing. I take it if I'm to know whether I'm a carrier, I need to take a test. Yes?
That's correct.
Tell me about the test. What is the test?
The test...
What happens to me? Suppose
A blood sample is drawn. It is tested to see whether your body has responded to an infection with the HTLV3 or LAV virus, or ARV, depending on where you are, and built antibodies to that virus. And those antibodies are the tag or the signal or whatever that denotes the fact that you have been infected with this virus. It doesn't tell you whether you will get AIDS or whether you will get AIDS-related complex. It just tells you that you have been infected and your body has responded. Now, I think that people who are concerned, who may be in the classic high-risk groups, should take the test if they have not altered their behavior, and if 3 caveats are obtained. 1, that it's anonymous. 2, that it's voluntary. And 3, that there is extensive counseling before and after. Those 3, I think, have to obtain.
Let me see about that. Dr. Dowdle, suppose I want to get a test. Where do I go to be tested?
Well, the Public Health Service has recommended, in fact, that those in the high-risk group should voluntarily
I don't know that I'm in a high-risk group. I just, I want to be tested.
Also, the recommendations are that these tests be provided at venereal disease clinics, as methadone clinics, etc.
No, you mean I have to go to a venereal disease clinic if I want to be tested?
No, almost every locality in almost every state has testing sites available which are generally well known. In addition to that, you could go to your private physician.
Wait a minute, I don't know where I get a test. I mean, I'm a reasonably well-informed person. I wouldn't have a clue where to go to get a test.
You would call up your local health department or your state health department or AIDS hotlines, which are generally available in every city. But you can also go to your private
I go into a
physician.
clinic.
Yes.
And then what happens to me?
You could go into a clinic, and it depends on the state and depends on the locality as to what their laws are. But it's either it's confidential or it could be anonymous, depending on the particular location.
Well,
where
let's
the test
take that
is
for
given.
starters. What happens to me physically?
The recommendations are, and they're generally followed by every state and locality, that you come in first and are counseled. You are told what the test means, you're told what the results might mean, you're told whether you might be at risk or not, and do you want the test. If you still want the test, you're given the test,
yeah, I want the
either
test.
with
That's
your
what I
name
came
or
for.
without, depending on the state or the location.
Is it pinprick?
No, it would actually be, blood would be drawn from the arm.
From the arm, just
That's
like...
right. That's
right.
correct. Yeah.
And then how long before I find out?
Again, it depends on the location. It depends upon the demand, but it could be 2 days, 3 days, or so on. And then there could be a second test if that test is positive.
How do I find out?
Well, you would come, again, it depends on the location. Either you would be asked to come back at a particular time, which is generally the way in which it's done, and you would come back and you would be told that those were positive, if indeed they were positive, and they would like to do another confirmatory type of test. And that would be done, and then you would come back again and be given the information. But in each case, counseling would be done. You would not be informed by mail.
Now, what do you mean counseling?
Counseling, again, indicating what the test means, informing the individual what the test means, whether or not that you wish to have the test, what change in behavior that you might undergo if you indeed have a positive test or if you have a negative test.
Suppose I show up positive, and I take the second test and I show up positive again.
Right.
How long am I going to spend in this office?
In the office, it could vary, 30 minutes.
And that's when I'm counseled?
That's during the counseling period, yes, that would be correct.
And what after that?
Well, after that, if you have a positive test, then you're informed as to what action you might take to prevent transmitting the disease to others or the virus infection to others.
Go ahead, inform me.
Or how you might change your own behavior.
Inform me, I want to know.
The recommendations that would be given to you if you were positive, they would such things as do not avoiding sex altogether is the first way in which you can obviously avoid transmitting it. On the other hand, if that's not always likely, we recognize that. Therefore, the use of condoms are some protection. Do not, for example, share such things as razors or any materials where you might be sharing blood, and do not share toothbrushes and so on and so forth. So there are recommendations in this type of line.
And Dr. Vernon, do I get counseling beyond that? That is there follow-up? Am I put into a program? Is there a support system that automatically takes over? And
in virtually every community, there's a support system that is primarily run by the gay community itself. Certainly in our state, that is the case. And
But what happens if I'm not gay?
well, if you're not gay, you're going to get extensive counseling from the public health people about whatever risk factors you may have. If you're a hemophiliac, you're very likely not to be involved with public health at all, but with the medical people who are caring for you routinely. But the point is that counseling is the critical moment in this day and age in terms of our ability to control the epidemic of the HTLV-3 virus.
Dr. Silverman, you stress voluntary.
Absolutely.
As I've heard it so far, I take this test, and all it is bad news.
Or it could be good news.
Could be good news. That is, you could tell me I don't have the virus.
And then I would tell you how to make sure you don't get the virus.
But if you test me positive, that's just total bad news.
Well, it isn't total bad news because you're equating a positive test with AIDS. The positive test is equated with infection. Infection is in the early part of a process which may not go on to AIDS, may not go on to AIDS-related complex, may just be that you've been infected, somehow your body has dealt with it, and that is not a problem. What we can do for you, though...
But I gather the chances are pretty good.
No, we don't know. We think probably in the range of 30 to 40% may go on to get AIDS. This is, again, somewhat speculation, but we see people who have tested positive for several years who are doing very well. We don't know of any disease where there's 100% infection going on to disease.
Here's my question. Why do I want to take this test?
Well,
it sounds to me like you're either going to tell me I don't have it, which is great, or you're going to tell me I have it, in which case there's nothing much I can do.
No, there's a great deal you can do. You have a responsibility to yourself and to society.
You mean there's something I can do for everyone else? What can I do for me?
Well, let's talk about you for a minute. You said you're straight, you're not gay. If you're positive, you have a spouse. You have a spouse that may be planning the two of you to have a child. That is very important information for you, for your wife, for your unborn child. Very important information. Now, maybe we will be able to do something which will eliminate that infection from you in the future, and you can go on to have a family. Right now, we'd counsel you against that. That's very important information for you. We would want you to stay as healthy as possible. We know that stress, we know that poor eating habits and lack of rest and lack of exercise does not help the immune system. It impairs the immune system. We can work with you to improve your health to the degree possible, but we're not giving you a death sentence. We may be giving you a death sentence with the diagnosis of AIDS. Unfortunately, that seems so. But there's no death sentence with the infection. That is just one piece of information. Now, granted, there are some individuals who shouldn't take the test because that information would be enough to throw them over the edge. In other words, they're labile personalities, and they might commit suicide, might do something...
What kind of personality?
Labile.
Labile. I don't know that.
Well, that their emotions that are such that they could go over the line, if you will, and take very drastic action. I mean, I've talked to some gay men who said, I'm following safe sex practices, I don't need that information, and if I knew I had it, I might commit suicide.
I'm sitting here hemorrhaging. We're talking about the responsibility of public health officials in this country to be able to allow counseling to take place for this kind of problem, HTLV-3 testing. I think Houston is a clear example of the lack of responsibility of the public health officials in that city and many other cities in this country, that they're not going to be able to handle the difficulties around counseling and the issue of exposure and what that means and what it doesn't mean. That's one thing. Two, I think what Dr. Silverman just mentioned is a very isolated case. There are many people I know. We treated at GMHC over 3,000 clients. Not one of them presented some of the issues that were presented in today's documentary. Not very few of them talked about suicide as a viable option. In fact, they talked more about regaining control in their lives and responding to their anger in a responsible way so that something could come out of the feelings of that.
But are you telling me that there's really no problem? If you offer testing, people will flock to it?
I don't think so. I think it depends on the kinds of information the public has and the kind of education they get. If they realize that knowing whether you're positive or negative can't tell you if you're going to get this disease, number one. Number two, I don't see how, in the name of good conscience and ethics, that this country is going to respond with the appropriate counseling needs of our population. They haven't up to date. Houston is I got to keep going back to it because it's a very clear example of, I think, what would happen here. The lack of education of our public health officials is a criminal. It's criminal. What happened to Fabian was criminal. Okay, the way he was victimized was criminal, and I think that's typical of the way public health officials in this country will respond. I think they will not want to know because of their own difficulties in dealing with all the issues.
Let me go to a public health official. Dr. Vernon, your testing in Colorado, I understand, is not mandatory.
Absolutely not.
But not anonymous.
Not anonymous, right.
Now, Dr. Silverman says you've got to have it anonymous.
We disagree. We happen to believe that the confidentiality protections that exist in statute and regulation in Colorado make it unnecessary for us to attempt to do disease control anonymously. We think of the individuals that we can't reach with counseling because we don't know how to reach them. We think of the individuals whom we may need to reach in the future, whom we could not reach if we did not have the information.
So you want to follow up on these people?
We want to follow up when there comes an opportunity for them to get a vaccine or a drug or some other benefit that is available. Yes, everyone says they will come out of the woodwork, they will all be there, but we know differently from previous behavior. We have an opportunity, because of a confidential medical record system, to reach individuals.
Now, why is Dr. Silverman so insistent on anonymity?
I hope he is insistent on anonymity being available in some way as an option, in some form, so that individuals would be encouraged to get the test who would otherwise get it. We agree that the important thing is being tested. Unfortunately, gay leadership in this country is still saying that the test is not useful. Many are saying that it should not be obtained, and we totally disagree with that.
Let me go to Denver. Mr. Rush? Can you hear me, Mr. Rush?
Yes, I can.
Mr. Rush, Dr. Vernon runs a system of testing which is not anonymous.
That's correct.
Do you trust it?
I can't be presumptuous enough to speak for the whole gay community, but there are many, many people here that don't feel good about that at all. We feel that there would be many more people who would be willing to come forward and be tested if they chose to, if we didn't have reportability. At this point, I think it's important to note, too, that we're not sure that there's any correlation between being tested and changing behavior. So I think that's another thing that, we need to look at on down the line.
Mr. Holloway, can I switch to you?
Yes.
Mr. Holloway, do you trust it?
I do not trust the actual confidentiality, even though it has never been broken. And the reason is this, that I believe that the strength of the gay community, the compassion, if you please, if it is applied to the gay community and we all work together, that we will be much better educated, we will get the test, we will know our situation, and just as we saw in the Houston situation, the compassionate intervention of the gay community is the key to it. When other people, when health officials and government officials could not be successful, the gay community could. The gay community in Colorado is saying to us, we must have anonymous testing if we're going to cooperate, if we're going to really find out about this disease and be successful in curbing the disease. Prevention and education have to go together. And I want to point out in relationship to what Mr. Lopez said, that many people who are being supported in our support groups here in Colorado are being supported not only by gay members of the community, but by other people, by people who are parents, who are concerned citizens. So I think our system here, if a person is tested, they find they are positive, and they're frightened, as we all are when we find out this drastic news, that there is a support system. I think the health departments and government officials have to learn to creatively work with the gay community. We haven't yet done that, and we must if we're going to be successful.
Thank you, Mr. Holloway.
I think, Charlie, there's also an issue. There's a fallacy here about confidentiality. I just recently got out of a hospital where when I was taken into the elevator, and I'm just one person, in my experience, I was put in the elevator, medical people were discussing the case of two patients in that hospital, used their names in the elevator, okay? A number of people came up to me in the corridors of that hospital and wanted to share personal experiences of what they felt and thought about the conditions of certain people in that place. There was no confidentiality. I mean, confidentiality was being broken by everyone in that entire system, and I think it's a fallacy to think that it's going to be observed by all the systems in this country. The reality is that, as we've seen, just Houston is only one example. I think Dallas is another example. You look across the board to the issues that people have, and you look across the board to the concerns people have about putting themselves personally on the line, and confidentiality will not be safeguarded. For Fabian, they certainly were not.
Mr. Yates-Rist, you have a reaction.
I think one of the things we're avoiding here is something that goes way underneath, it lies way underneath all of the discussions of quarantine with Mr. Danmeyer, Mr. Vernon's testing, Mr. Silverman's testing, and that is, first of all, when you're talking about testing and knowing your antibody status, the counseling they're offering is going to give us nothing that education doesn't give us already. Instead of wasting our time and money in this country, which we have very little of for health currently under the Reagan administration of all things, why aren't we spending all of this money on education? We know it works because it's worked in New York City. There is as much as an 85% drop in venereal disease rates in New York City. But there's something beyond this.
That's the same statistic that I think Dr. Silverman was adverting to.
And may I just say that studies have shown in the testing in San Francisco a significant change of behavior as a result of testing, as stated by those who were tested.
Well, I would like to know how much better you could get than 85%, and we don't have testing in New York. But let me make another point, because this is a point that's being avoided all evening, and that is you're asking us to let the government come into our lives, to test, to quarantine, and we're avoiding the whole issue of how much this society hates homosexuals. We heard it on TV from Dr. Hotze tonight, who has to say it's inordinate lust, it's anonymous sex. He wants to avoid the truth of homosexuality, which is it's about love in relationships every bit as much as heterosexuality is. But that's not what people want to hear. And when we have homophobic people in our government ready to climb down our throats at any minute to destroy the gay community, why should we trust the government? Why should we trust Senator Danmeyer? Is he going to protect the right of homosexuals to live freely in this society?
May I respond to that?
Yes, Congressman.
You see, one thing you may be overlooking is that the foundation of Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian ethic, teaches us.
Oh, there's a big one. There's a big one.
God comes in at this
God's
point.
plan for man is one man and one woman who come together and form a family unit. That's the basis of our society.
Really don't
Wait
want
a minute,
to,
I didn't interrupt you.
I don't want to hear about what you say. I am a homosexual.
Mr. Yates-Rist, he's absolutely right. He didn't interrupt you.
I didn't interrupt you. And I can tell you, my friend, that I will, so long as I'm permitted to be in public office, and even after I'm retired from public office, I will affirm the support, the affirmation of the heterosexual ethic unapologetically.
Now, wait a minute.
Now, that doesn't mean...
We got nothing against you doing that.
Well, I think,
but his problem is that there's a downside
say,
to what you say. It sounds like you're the homophobe that he's talking about.
No, listen, I affirm a support for a heterosexual ethic.
How about affirming a support for a homosexual?
And naturally, those two are in conflict. And I am not about to apologize for my respect
Since it's my life he's talking about, I would like to interrupt, because it's his kind who have interrupted homosexuals for our whole lives when we try to speak for ourselves.
I believe.
Now, I'd like to pick up on
It's only going to work if it's one at a time. All right? Your turn.
I am 38 years old. I am in a relationship which is stable and beautiful, and it's something that is available to every homosexual man and woman in this country if people like you will leave us alone. But as long as you are out there setting public policy and determining exactly the way this disease is going to be treated by the government, I will not trust the government, and I urge every gay man and woman out there to rebel against any impulse of this government to get into our lives. If we trust you, we'll be ridden down the river, and let everyone be aware of it.
All right, now it's my turn to interrupt. No. I tell you what my concern is. We've talked about the homosexual aspect of this. Let's assume I'm a father of a daughter who's 12 years old. Dr. Wolfsey, does any of what's happened here, discussed here tonight, relate to me? Do I have anything to worry about?
I listened to all of this as an infectious disease specialist. I realize we're talking about an infectious disease, and that should be unrelated to color or sexual preference. It is very irritating to hear all of this going back and forth. 25% of people who have AIDS and possibly a greater percent of all those that carry the virus are not homosexual. It's an infectious disease that affects a variety of people. Does the father of a 12-year-old child have something to be concerned about? Very, very, very little. However,
I don't need to worry about my daughter.
AIDS, in some way or another, is going to affect everybody in the United States in the next several years. And I don't mean by direct risk to themselves, but by their contacts or their associates. And as far as having a child, be it a male child, or a female child, a boy or a girl, who is entering the years of sexual experimentation, a boy may find out that he's gay, and it's like a lot of other things in society that have been sort of kept under covers, child abuse, etc. It's been going on. We just don't realize that there are a relatively large percent of the population that is gay. That's just the way they are. And I think that there's probably been inhibition of boys in their teenage years who are afraid to express this and may experiment without the advice and counsel. For a 12-year-old girl, I doubt that most 12-year-old girls are sexually active, but there may be some who are. And as the years go on and the number of cases increases, we have to educate everybody in a perfectly reasonable way without being afraid to talk about sex or pretend that it isn't a normal part of life, and just discuss AIDS, that AIDS is part of our society, and sexuality is something that people should be comfortable with, and that there are diseases people can get through
All
sex.
right, so let's do it. Let's assume my daughter is 14 and my son is 16, and maybe I'm a little out of touch with them. Maybe I don't know exactly what goes on in some parts of their lives. Do I counsel them? Is that the choice? Do they get it someplace else?
The parent is best. But if the parent doesn't know
Right, now,
or isn't comfortable...
What do I tell them?
You start by trying to be at ease with the issue of sexuality and realizing...
All right, I'm relaxed, I'm at ease. Now, what do I tell them?
Okay. You tell them that there are diseases that people can get from having sex. And some of them are easy to cure, and some of them aren't. And you don't know very much about certain of those diseases. And you want to be sure they get information. And so you find whatever your community has that they can get the information. You endorse education in the schools so that it's not treated as a big deal. It's just something that's there. We have to learn about not taking candy from strangers. We have to learn to look right and left when we cross the street. We have to learn to put on a seatbelt. We have to learn about sexuality and using condoms if that's appropriate.
Wait a minute,
wait,
go slow on that one. Go slow on that one. We're going to learn that in school, that is how to use condoms in sex?
You have to learn that that's a subject that has to be approached. Young people in high school, and in some instances in junior high school, are sexually active. And it's pulling the wool over our eyes to say that because we don't want it to happen, either on religious grounds or moral grounds, or because we're afraid of diseases, or because it offends us, it's happening. And if there's a good relationship parent to child, you can explain what the issues are about and raise the child as a mature person. But stop putting our heads in the sand.
Do I need to tell my children about needles, too?
Yes.
Dr. Krim, do I need to tell them about needles?
Yeah, you can tell your children about needles.
Use clean needles, kids.
No,
make sure you use clean needles.
No. You start through the biology, as with the sex. You have to know about the disease, the virus, the transmission, and so forth. And then the role of the drug culture and the dirty needles in the transmission of the disease. They must be given a reason to avoid a certain danger. And then in addition, I would not only talk to the children about the dirty needles, but to our government representatives, that to deny the availability of clean needles to drug addicts is virtually to sentence a certain number of people to die nowadays. and that laws have to be changed in this regard.
Now, if I'm a parent who's too tight to talk about sex and needles and drugs with my kids,
well, then there are psychologists, counselors, there are other people who can do it. But it must be done. Somebody must do it.
does it need to be done in the schools?
I think so. I think it's a good place also.
Congressman Dannemeyer, is it going to be done in the schools?
Well, I'd like to come back to this
No,
other
no, I want
topic.
this one. Is it going to be done in the schools?
I believe that a school board in our system, we believe in local control, and school districts of America has to make a decision as to what type of subjects will be taught in the curriculum, and that decision is going to be answered in different ways in school boards across the country. I don't think that we should be making a blanket, certainly not at the federal level. We should not be making a blanket law with respect to what should be taught on the issue of sexuality or drugs in every school district in America.
You don't think there's an issue on which we need federal leadership?
I think there are areas where federal leadership is called for. I've introduced 5 pieces of legislation, and I'd like to respond to my friend, if I may.
No. You're not playing fair with me,
I'd like to.
You're just not playing fair with me.
I think I should. What 2 men or 2 women or a man and a woman do in the privacy of their own home is it's none of my business, it's none of the government's business. But when those 2 men come out of their privacy of their home and they come into the public sector where I work and they want to change the 1964 Federal Civil Rights Act so as to include sexual preference as something that it would be an enforceable Federal Civil Rights Act, they've got my attention, because at that point they are seeking to use the federal law as a means of changing the basic culture of America so as to equate the homosexual lifestyle on a par with the heterosexual lifestyle. And at that point,
Hey, you guys,
they've got my
can
attention.
handle this after this is over, all right? I'll set
They've
up
got
a
my
private
attention.
discussion for you, all right? I'm interested in knowing what's going to happen to my kids, right? I'm curious about that. I want to know, is somebody going to tell my kids about needles and condoms? I want to know, I'll tell you what I want to know. Miss McLaughlin, is somebody going to go even further than that? You see any future in making needles free to people?
Well, I
Or
speak as
condoms free to people?
Oh, I speak as a pragmatist. However beneficial I think it might be to distribute free needles, it's not going to sell. The public isn't going to accept it. I think a lot more could be done with condoms. But I think I would like to say something about what I've heard.
Let me just stop on that for a minute. I hear a ring of reality to what you say. I'm not doubting it as things stand at the moment. But imagine the clock turned forward so that the numbers on that pyramid get bigger. Is it possible that the public will come around to a point where they see that this thing is on us and we've got to do something about it?
I feel the clock is going to go forward. But I think before the public will accept the distribution of free needles for drug use, the public will react in far different ways, in very, very unpleasant ways. But the point I would really like to make here is everyone has talked about this public health department and that public health department and this hospital and that hospital and how we're going to approach the disease. And what is not being said here is that we have no federal leadership at the level of the White House. We have no guidelines coming down that are going to be universal. I don't mean out of CDC and how we should take care of people who are infected in hospitals. We have no policy that says, what will every single health department in the United States be doing? What will every single school be doing to protect the children? We're still talking about this disease as if it were a new form of measles or something. We have a lethal disease. We don't know how many of the 2 million people who are infected are really going to convert. This disease is going to run 20 years before we'll know that.
Miss McLaughlin, let me go to San Francisco. Mr. Reynolds? Mr. Reynolds?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Reynolds?
Yes.
We're talking education.
Yes.
we're talking about whether it's possible through education to make serious progress with AIDS. Do you think it is?
I think it's very possible. Many of us that have been working in the AIDS community have been able to touch people, to help them look at their fears, to help them gain new understanding and information that they have then been able to use to help their friends and family members. It's been a ripple effect that I've seen.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Dr. Silverman, we're coming towards the end of our time with this issue. Tell me, what is the challenge that AIDS presents us, as you see it at this point? What is it going to take for us to get through?
We're being faced with a lethal disease, and all of society is on trial, I believe. I sincerely believe that how society deals with this is going to say a great deal about us as individuals. We have an indiscriminate virus, as was described by Dr. Wofsy, that doesn't know sexual preference, doesn't know economic, doesn't know color, doesn't know ethnicity, none of that. If the setting is correct, it can happen. We have to get away from the moralistic issues surrounding this. We have to have, as Ms. McLaughlin says, leadership from government. We can't have a president who says this is the #1 health problem and then cuts $51 million out of research, prevention, education, community services. There is no federal money in community services. There's almost no federal money in education. We have a disease for which there is no cure and no vaccine. The only defense we have is education. If we can educate everybody, if they will follow what we say, we can stop the spread tomorrow.
Dr. Silverman, one of the things that contributes to the problem, in a sense, is the sexual revolution that's taken place in this country in the last, say, 30 years. It sounds to me, from what you're suggesting, that we have yet another sexual revolution in front of us, or maybe a continuation of the one we're on.
Revolution goes around.
Revolution goes around.
And I believe that we are seeing changes. One thing that I want to stress.
Around to what?
Well, I want to stress one thing that keeps getting lost, gets glossed over. And what was said about New York, San Francisco, and all over, the change of behavior has been absolutely phenomenal, miraculous. Take 100 people who are overweight, get them to lose weight and keep it off. If you do 5%, you feel you've been successful. We're talking in terms of 90%. That's incredible change of behavior.
That's in the gay community.
That's in the gay community.
And now we're talking also, as we extend it, to changes of behavior in the heterosexual community as well.
That's correct. And there's no reason to believe that heterosexuals will not respond if given the unvarnished truth, without moralism, without bigotry, with compassion and sensitivity, like we should be giving to the people who are now with AIDS, those who could get AIDS. We don't have to talk about, you were saying, should the school do it? No, you should do it. But if you don't do it, I don't want your kids to be victims.
Mr. Lopez, 15 seconds. Last word from you.
I may eventually die as a result of this disease, but I would consider my death an act of murder for the lack of governmental funding, and I would consider it murder by my own government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez. Well, the challenge, at least as I see it here, is one of looking at the reality and taking off the blinders that seem to come with ignorance and fear. Judy, to you.
Thank you, Charles. Tonight we brought you a program that we hope has raised legitimate and important questions about our ability to deal with this epidemic. Like some medieval plague, it has brought out our worst fears and prejudices. But it is also a test of our humanity and our society, because in protecting the rights of any one individual, we protect all of us. For Frontline, I'm Judy Woodruff. Good night.
I'm Howard Brody. I'm a specialist in infectious diseases. By the time someone's got intensively ill, we've shot our wad as doctors. No matter what we do, we're going to lose. You know, it's a flashback to the 19th century. That's what medicine was there. To cure, never. To diagnose, rarely. To comfort, always. was the role of the physician. And that's what we're doing here. We're doing 19th century medicine. Okay, the virus has taken the entire 20th century medical away.
And his fibrinogen was 166, where lower limb normal is 170. That's a good question. I don't know what
This is Donald Abrams, and I'm the Assistant Director of the AIDS Clinic at San Francisco General Hospital. I have probably been directly involved in seeing maybe 2,000 people with AIDS and related conditions over the past 4 years. Been busy. I spoke to my grandmother recently, who was 84 years old, and she was sort of telling me about her friends who were becoming demented and about her friends who were dying. And I said to my grandmother, I said, you know, I'm 34 and you're 84, and I think I've had as many friends become demented and die as you have, and that's not really fair. I mean, it gets to be devastating.
And don't we have an empty room? Let me check.
My name is Gayleen G. I'm the head nurse of the outpatient Ward 86 AIDS clinic. I think one of the strengths of our clinic is that it is okay to cry in clinic. But I think 2 weeks ago, I was in a staff meeting and I said, this is it, this is enough. I know it's tough. It has been a terrible month. We had about 27, 30 deaths, and we wrote all the names on the board. But I am not going to let you sit here and cry all the time. You have work to do, and you've got to keep going. Because there's still people out there who are counting on you.
Anyway, Barkowski might give us our answer. Might be a better way to go.
Yeah.
If they're going to do it anyway. Yeah.
My name is Paul Scherer, and I'm a counselor with the Shanti Project on 5B, the AIDS ward at General Hospital. I think there are a lot of issues with AIDS that are analogous to warfare. We have certainly the combat fatigue in terms of the caregivers. Vast numbers of young men dying is something that's endemic in war, but not in peacetime. So we have parents burying their sons, and that's not the way it's supposed to be.
The special phone service provided by the American Red Cross and the Whitman Walker Clinic will continue this evening after this program. If you have a question about AIDS or local AIDS treatment, call 728-6600 for the D.C. chapter of the American Red Cross or 332-5939 for the Whitman Walker Clinic. Those numbers again, the American Red Cross, 332-5939, and the Whitman Walker Clinic.
For a transcript of this program, please send $4 to Frontline, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH, Boston, which is solely responsible for its content.
But